Hi, today we're going to be talking about gardening in difficult times. I can call it survival gardening or Sur-Thrival gardening, as I've coined the term, um, but it all ends up being the same thing. There's a rush of people gardening for the first time in their lives right now because of scared, scared people thinking that there aren't going to be enough food supplies at the stores, and to an extent, they are correct. There are going to be food shortages. To what extent, no one knows for sure, but we know now that farmers are plowing under their fields. And if you are a meat eater, we know that certain farm animals aren't being harvested, if you will, right now. And the future is always a question mark. I've always felt that way, and that's why I consider myself a prepper. It's smart to be a prepper. Think of the Three Little Pigs. It's always better to have something prepared than to be caught without it. Look at the toilet paper thing. Why didn't people have a couple of extra rolls of toilet paper, a couple, dozen extra rolls of everything in their life? But anyway, when it comes to food, that's one of the essentials you need to survive. And so there's a rush of people gardening for the first time. In fact, a lot of the seed stores that I go to buy my seeds every year when I garden, they're having shortages, and a lot of them have closed their websites down to try to restock. And I've never seen anything like it. It's really an interesting phenomenon. And so the gist of this is to make sure you're prepared in terms of food. I have always told people to have enough dry food to last them a long time. There's nothing unusual in the world of prepping to have a 50-pound bag of rice and a 50-pound bag of beans, or multiples of those, and as well as things like dried fruit, dried nuts, anything that you might need when the food supply isn't there. I have also backup supplements and compounding powders that I can use if they aren't available for a period of time. So when this whole thing threw everyone into a panic, I wasn't in a panic. I had plenty of toilet paper, I had plenty of paper towels, I had plenty of alcohol and peroxide, and food. I have plenty of food, and I know how to grow it. But growing your own food is becoming very important for people right now, and for good reason. So I'm going to give you the basics of how to get started and what would be important to grow at this time. I was planting my spring garden, as I always do, and when things started getting a little iffy, I changed what I was going to grow this year, because I wanted to make sure, instead of growing things which I normally would, interesting new rare fruits and vegetables, that's what I like to do, is I like to grow food that I can't find at the store. But I also grow staple crops as well. But this year I'm sticking to, I'd say, 80% of what I'm growing are staple crops that I'm going to need to keep me and my loved ones fed. So we're going to discuss some of those things, and then I'm going to take you on a tour of my garden, and you can see the setup I have. I'm growing in many different ways. I have perennial crops For instance, I have on a small suburban lot, I have 25 fruit trees. I've got a dozen moringa trees. I have berry bushes. I have root crops. I have garlic and onions, and as well as annual crops. I usually always have greens growing, things like collards and kale and greens of that nature. Something new that I have this year is a hydroponics house. I've been playing around with hydroponics for, I'd say, about 5 years. And I really started getting more keen of an interest in hydroponics over the last year, I would say. And I'm going to describe to you guys a way that you can grow hydroponically with no prior knowledge of hydroponics. And I can get you started right away with simple things that you can get from your local hardware store. So that's going to be an essential part of my food growing from here on forwards. In that vein of hydroponics, and I'll go into it later, but in a relatively small area with relatively small amount of input, you can grow a vast amount of greens and rapidly. So instead of maybe taking 2 months to grow a head of lettuce or something like that, you can grow a head of lettuce in maybe 4 or 5 weeks. And they're wonderful heads of lettuce. They're the greens, the kale, whatever you're growing hydroponically, whatever I have grown hydroponically. It's delicious and it looks great. And I was always kind of hesitant to grow using fertilizers. I really enjoy growing in soil and amending my soil with natural products. Usually things that I have here at the suburban homestead, I have my own worm farms where I can keep a closed loop of the food scraps that I get during the week, and I feed them to my worms, and then soon thereafter I have wonderful fertilizer. And I use other fertilizers on the homestead of natural origins to keep my crops well fertilized. Things as simple as I keep large containers, like for instance a 20-gallon tote or a 55-gallon drum, and I'll have filtered water in there, and I'll put things like weeds before they start getting a seed head on them. I throw weeds in there. I don't have grass on the property anymore, but I used to throw grass in there. Comfrey, I'm growing comfrey, which is well known in the the permaculture world, which I do have a permaculture certificate as well. I'm more proud of that than my medical degree. So I have comfrey growing on the property, which has many uses in terms of nutrition, medicinal, as well as fertilizer. It's a great dynamic accumulator. And so you cut off some comfrey. You can either chop and drop it, which means you cut the comfrey or other dynamic accumulators, and you can drop them right in place, right near, let's say, a fruit tree, and they'll break down over time and provide fertilizer for the tree. Or in the case of the, let's say, the 55-gallon drum, you can tear up some comfrey, shred it up a little bit, and put it in there with some immature weeds. I put a lot of moringa leaves in there because I have a lot of abundant and extra moringa, and both between comfrey and moringa, that's tons of fertilizer right there. and you let that brew. There's no, you can get uh, recipes for compost fertilizers, uh, where you add an air bubbler, and I do that also. But in this case, you can just put these vegetable products, vegetative products, in a drum or a tote with some water, and just let them start to break down into the water, and the nutrients from all those weeds and grass and greens and comfrey and moringa will break down and assimilate into the water, and you use that water um, when you're fertilizing. I dilute it down. Maybe it just depends how fresh the solution is. But if it's really potent, I might use a 10% solution, and I water my crops with it. And it's extremely effective. When I put moringa fertilizer on crops, it's like using fish emulsion. You just get an explosion of growth. But getting back to what you want to do to get crops in the ground right now that may benefit you this year and benefit you in the way of having stable and staple food for you and your family. So, the things I would think about growing are definitely things like beans. So you can grow pole beans and bush beans. Pole beans grow up a trellis, like a string trellis or a wood trellis, whatever kind of trellis you want to make. And bush beans, you don't need a trellis. They'll just grow a little bit bushy. They are not as productive, but you don't need to build a trellis. And you can do succession planting of those crops. So maybe every few weeks, plant new beans, and you can continually harvest beans for the next few months. I would also be growing garlic and onions. A lot of herbalists say that if they could have one herb to grow, if they only had one herb to grow, they would grow garlic. And it's a potent medicine as well as a tasty culinary product. So garlic and onions would be a thing to grow along with the beans. And the beans you can eat fresh. You can also dry them and have dry beans later in the year, maybe in the winter when you don't have access to your garden. And then one really, really major thing to grow right now is potatoes. On this homestead, I have lots of potatoes in the ground. I took out the front lawn years ago and instead started growing food. And in permaculture, we have many levels of growing food. So the very basic one is under the ground, and that's your root crops. So I've got purple potatoes, I have regular yellow sweet potatoes, all over the front. So that's the ground, the underground layer, and no one knows it's there. They think it's ivy. The neighbors think it's ivy, and so it's stealth gardening, and you can grow a ton of food and fill a lot of bellies just by utilizing a front yard area as growing potatoes. I also have them growing in the backyard. In the back, I've got other types of potatoes, red potatoes, white potatoes, and all you have to do is go and get organic. You must get organic potatoes from your local health food store or farmer's market. All you have to do is drop them under the ground. I'd bury them, let's say maybe 3-4 inches under the ground, but it's super simple. You don't have to get real technical about it. You can cut them in pieces where you can let your potatoes start to grow eyes, little shoots where the eyes are. And wherever you have an eye, you can cut that potato up into many pieces, and you can get a lot of different plants from that. However, I usually just drop a single potato into the ground. I've done both methods, but now I just throw a potato back in. When I'm harvesting potatoes, I'll just throw one of my really good potatoes that I'm harvesting right back into the ground because of its genetics. And you can use those as seed potatoes. So go into your local health food store or a farmer's market. That's where you can get your potato seeds from. And if you have a front yard, I grow the whole thing in potatoes. In sweet potato, if you live in an area where you can grow sweet potatoes, especially places like the South, you can grow them a lot longer during the season. But I have an abundant amount of purple potatoes, sweet potatoes, all kinds of different kinds of sweet potatoes growing out in the front. And but whatever potatoes you enjoy, get them in the ground. Get them in the ground now. They grow very well. You'll know right away if they're growing because they send up green shoots. And at this point, I wouldn't worry about whether to hill potatoes or don't hill potatoes. Just put them in the ground and let them start growing. And if you have a decent sized front yard, or not even that big, you're going to have potatoes. And potatoes, it's a starch and it will fill your belly. And, on a normal basis, I wouldn't recommend eating nothing but potatoes. But it is a staple crop and it'll keep you full. They are, the purple potatoes and the sweet potatoes are extremely nutritious. But if you have, the 50-pound bag of rice, even if you are low on rice, you can have a potato instead. And so this is a very important crop to grow because it'll keep you full. It'll provide calories for you, and the calories are important during these times. I would not, in a survival gardening situation, think about growing your own grains. You can grow your own grains, but it usually takes a lot of knowledge and space. And so people who are living in a small lot or suburban situation, you probably won't be able to grow enough grains to make any significant impact in feeding yourself. But potatoes, you will. So if you're growing potatoes and you're growing beans, you're going to have a lot of food for yourself. Now, the next thing I would grow are greens. I would grow outside of a hydroponic system even. I would be growing lots of things like kale and collards. If you just want massive amounts of greens, grow collard greens. They grow abundantly and massively, and they're extremely healthful. They're of the cruciferous family, and so we know all the benefits from eating cruciferous vegetables. Broccoli, I would grow more for the greens, and if you do get a floret, a flowering head, that's the part of the broccoli that most people think of when they eat broccoli, then you can, that would be a bonus. But in the beginning, just grow things for the leaves. So you're talking about kale, lots of different kinds of kale. You can grow dinosaur kale or dino kale, lacinato kale. There's many names for that type of kale. You can grow red Russian kale. You can grow curly kale. There's lots of different kinds of kale. I probably grow about 5 to 7 types of kale at any one time. Your greens will also keep you fed, and they will provide nutrition. Greens are extremely important in terms of our daily nutrition. That should, in my opinion, be a large portion of what your diet consists of, are greens. They're extremely beneficial for your health. So between the potatoes and the beans and the greens and the garlic and the onions, you really have established a food that's going to feed you for a long period of time, keep you full, and is highly nutritious. And then there are some other crops if you can get to it, especially if you have a homeowners association, which I would suggest getting out of a situation like that. But let's say they say you can't have a garden in your front yard. Well, what you can do is grow potatoes because people think it's ivy. And you can also grow Jerusalem artichokes or sunchokes, and it's of the sunflower family. They're beautiful. They grow very high, and there's a beautiful flower, like sunflower looking flower, during the growth period, but it's under the ground where you're getting your food in this particular situation. And they do spread, which is people think is a problem. I think is a benefit, because the more sunchokes I have growing, the more I'm happy. Like I said, they're beautiful, and under the ground you get wonderful crops. It's kind of like almost like a Chinese chestnut. For people who eat Chinese food, I don't go to Chinese restaurants. They're not usually good for your health. I don't usually go to restaurants in particular. There are some good vegan, organic restaurants in the area, but other than that, and that's another discussion. So Jerusalem artichokes or sunchokes is another thing you can be planting. Other root crops that are going to be important in a gardening in trying times would be growing. Other root crops would be beets and carrots. Beets provide the nutrition that beets provide would be something high in nitric acid, which nitric oxide, which is really wonderful for your cardiovascular health. And carrots, beta carotene, and roughage that these two crops provide would be beneficial too. So those are the main things I would be growing. The other things I would grow are sprouts and microgreens. I just finished a lecture on tape regarding sprouts and microgreens. And for 20, 50, or $100 worth of microgreen seeds, you'll be able to provide greens for you and your family on a consistent basis and rapidly. If you start gardening now, you're not going to get food for quite a while. You may not get, your first crop, let's say a lettuce crop, for 6 to 8 weeks. But if you start growing microgreens, you can have fresh greens to eat in a week. And so I encourage everyone to be growing microgreens. In fact, microgreens and sprouts are even more nutritious than, let's say, the collard greens and the kale and the broccoli that I spoke of. So you get between 5 and 50 times more nutrition from the same volume of sprouts as you would from the parent counterpart. So, and by the way, those sprout seed companies are having shortages as well, but they still have seeds, so you can still call one of these companies and order seeds. Go to the internet websites. Some of the seed companies I use for sprouts and microgreen seeds, and I don't usually buy my gardening seeds from them, but my sprouts and my microgreen seeds I get from Mountain Valley Seeds, which is also called, let's see, I can't remember, there's two names that they go by, but Mountain Valley Seeds. I can put in the link to this video or the description, I can look up the name of that company. And the other one is Mums. Mums is a seed sprouting and microgreen seed company out of Canada. They grow a clean product. and it's very reliable. So actually, the first, I just have a probably $100 order of microgreen seeds right here. So I just needed to look over. So it's True Leaf Seed is the same as Mountain Valley. So True Leaf Seed. And you can get all different kinds of microgreen seeds there. And I like to grow things that I normally wouldn't grow out in the garden or eat in any great numbers. So, if you want to eat shiso or, you know, rutabaga or things that you wouldn't normally grow out in the garden or buy at the grocery store, you can grow microgreen seeds for the sprouts and microgreens for those. So, really quickly recapping, and then I'm going to take everyone out to take a look at my garden, my front and backyard garden on this suburban homestead. Actually, before we go through the recap, I did want to talk about some other things that you should do for self-sufficiency, which would include, besides gardening, is starting a worm farm and worm composting. It's called vermicomposting, and it's as simple as ordering 500 or 1,000 worms. You can either buy them locally, which that's how I started, or you can buy them off the internet. And there's plenty of videos. I'll probably make a video on how to start an easy worm composting system. I do it in a much easier and efficient way than you see a lot of videos on YouTube. But I have had worm composting farms for many years, and right now I probably have about 8 worm farms going at any one time because I produce a lot of compost. If you're juicing, if you eat a lot of greens, a lot of vegetables, you're going to have a lot of food scraps. And what to do with the juice pulp when you're done juicing, you can put in the worm farm. And you can also make crackers, dehydrated crackers out of them, and they're delicious. I've made a raw dehydrated pizza crust, vegan pizza crust out of that, and it was fabulous. And so there's lots of different things you can do with your juice pulp. I would never throw it out. At the very least, compost it. You should never throw out any organic material. Always try to close the loop the best you can. So that's one other thing that you can do to enhance your survival garden. Another thing that helps with self-sufficiency is you can catch rainwater. You can harvest it. I do that. I also harvest gray water. It's amazing how much water you waste when you wash your clothes. If you're not using bleach, of course, you would never want to put bleached water on your garden. It'll kill everything. But there are a lot of alternatives to bleach that you can use that are safe and safe for the environment and will clean your clothes. So every soap product and so on that we use is biodegradable because I use gray water systems. And so a lot of washing machines, even the high efficiency washing machines, use a ton of water. For instance, the old washing machines could use 25 to 40 gallons of water from one wash. 40 gallons of water from one washing of clothes. So if you don't pay attention to what you do in life, you can be wasting a lot of natural resources. And so it's one thing to say that you're for the environment, but what are you actually doing for the environment? Well, gray water harvesting is one of them. It's really pretty easy. I have a 55-gallon drum right next to the washing machine, and I run the outlet pipe from the washing machine, and it drains right into the 55-gallon drum. I have a screen that I use from just pantyhose, and I my mother's old pantyhose that I secure on with a zip tie to the water outlet. Goes into the 55-gallon drum, and then I use a simple transfer pump, and I can attach a gardening hose to that, and I can garden everything on my property. And I use uh, pretty much that alone for all my irrigation needs. Sometimes I need some supplemental water that I need to use from a hose bib in the garden, but if you wash clothes, which everyone does, you're going to be producing and harvesting lots of water if you want to go that direction. But everything we do in life, we should think about the consequences it has, our actions have. And so whether that's eating certain kinds of food and what kind of destruction it has on the environment, or the water we use, like I just spoke of, or if we have food scraps left over after we prepared a meal, do we just throw them in the trash, or do we put them in a compost bin? Do we put them in a worm composting bin? Any kind of composting, it doesn't matter what it is, things will break down. In fact, I'm going to be experimenting with black soldier fly composting probably in the next week or two. I'm really excited about that. That's another subject, and I can do a video on that as well. But everything we do in life, we should think about what the consequence of that action is. I do. All throughout the day, I think about the consequences of how I talk to people, what I do, what I buy, and the consequence of what that product has, whether it's made with slave labor or was it made with pesticides and herbicides, and how was it grown, how was it produced, who produced it, who touched it. So there's a consequence of everything we do in life, and there's a consequence of the thoughts we have at every moment. There's a consequence to having positive thoughts, and another consequence of having negative thoughts. So everything we do in life, we should think about what the consequence is. So thus, when you're trying to have a sustainable agricultural system like I tried to have in this permaculture system that I've designed for my homestead, I think about repurposing and reutilizing all kinds of things. When I get my Gary Knoll protein powder or green powder or red powder, I save the containers, and I've made hydroponic growing containers out of them, or I use them to store nuts and bolts in the garage, or I use them to store seeds, or there's a number of things I use these containers for. It's just one example of trying to avoid this use and throw away society that we have. It's better to think about the consequences of each action we have, what the consequences are of those actions. So I also so other things I do on the homestead to kind of create a closed loop is I ferment my own products. I make fermented vegetables, fermented drinks, fermented probiotics, and I'm going to have a lecture, which I have another videotape going right now about fermentation. And one of the things I ferment besides vegetables and probiotics is a special kombucha called Jun, which I'll probably talk about in the fermentation lecture as that goes on, that video. But it's something where you don't have to use granulated sugar. You could use honey. So if you have a beehive and you harvest your honey from that, that's one thing you can use to make something called Jun kombucha, Jun. And so my fermentation of the products that I have. For instance, when I have an apple, I don't throw the cores away. I save the cores and I make apple cider vinegar. Any fruit scraps that I have around, I also make, I ferment them and I make drinks or I make vinegar out of them. So when we have that kind of mindset, um, if we all do this together, we can conserve a lot of the natural resources we have on this earth, and it makes us better people too, I believe, and it brings us closer to the earth. So uh, I think at this point, I'm going to take everyone on a tour of my garden, a quick tour, so they can see how I've implemented some of these things. Now, out in my raised bed gardens, not a whole lot's going on right now. I completely took everything out of the raised beds. I re-amended them, and so they're ready to be planted now. So I have started a lot of seeds. I have a lot of seedlings ready to go into my raised bed gardens, and I'm excited about that. But right now, there's not a whole lot going on in there. I do have some tomatoes growing and garlic and things of that nature, but for the most part, that's not what I'm going to concentrate on the tour. However, if you actually look at the raised beds themselves, that's something that I think everyone would be interested um, in constructing, because unless you want to grow straight into the ground, which is okay and it's great, but if you have rocky soil, or there's something wrong with your soil for some reason, or your ground, or you just have cement, um, or you only have a balcony, you can do container gardening. But raised beds, you can control the soil, you can amend it any way you want, and so raised beds are great. And so I constructed raised beds a number of years ago. They're still around. I um, coated them with coconut oil so that to try to prevent rot, which occurs to the wood when it contacts moisture and soil for a while. And so far, I've been pretty happy with how that's worked out. So after all these years, they're in really good shape. Um, but you don't have to use wood when making a raised bed. You can use anything you have, stones, blocks, anything you have, you can use to build up, to contain soil in. And like I said, raise containers. You can have a container garden. You don't have to construct raised beds. You could just get 20-gallon totes from the store, and you can make self wicking beds in those containers. And those, I have wicking beds that I either purchased as wicking beds or I've made my own, a combination of. I have one wicking bed right now that I made. It's starting to fall apart after several years of use, but I've got goji berries growing in there. Others I have onions and strawberries and things like that. But a container gardening is great. So even though I have raised beds and also grow in the ground, and I have perennial trees and things like that, I still utilize container gardening. I think it's an essential part of a small homestead. Um, so right now, why don't we go out to the front and backyard and see how I've arranged it? But do it however you like. I have a permaculture background, and so I've done everything in a certain way where I have root crops. Uh, I have crops growing low to the ground. I have shrubs. I have trees, and I also have vining crops. So I use every layer to grow on. And so I'm growing up vertically from under the ground all the way up through trees, and vining crops growing up along the trees. So I'm utilizing every space and every layer I possibly can. So let's go ahead and go outside and take a look and I'd be happy to show you what I have growing on outside. So I have a pomegranate tree that anchors this side of our planter in the front. Here's a tangerine tree, and below that on the ground level, actually below the ground, is purple potato, and there's vast amounts all around here. I've got wood chip on the ground, and there's many benefits of wood chips. There's more purple potato here, and I've got right here I have a ruby red grapefruit, and then of course just some beauty as well. And then if you go this way, I chopped these, or pruned heavily, these moringa trees. This is a black mission fig. And this is a tiger fig. It has striped figs. This is your calamara. I believe that's how you say it, fig. And you can see there's one right there. All right. I have a cherimoya tree here. And at the base I have comfrey. It's ready to be chopped and dropped. There's some more figs. It's beautiful. Here's some sprawling, vining tomato. Here's comfrey that's going to flower, and they're beautiful flowers. Here's another cherimoya tree. This one's a Mexican guava, and it's a beautiful tree. This is a pineapple guava with beautiful flowers. They're spectacular. They look like fireworks going off. I hope the camera can pick that up. And so those are the flowers, and then these are the fruits forming right here. Here I've got standard sweet potato. Nasturtiums, and there must be over 2,000 flowers on these nasturtiums. This is an apple tree that I need to take out and put another tree in here. This one didn't make it. There's some issues with getting it planted on time. And Cuban oregano, just a transplant off of a cutting I made. Fuji apple tree with the base of nasturtiums and comfrey. And this is starting to flower. There's a flower bud on there. And more nasturtiums. There's a sunflower amongst the nasturtiums. And another sunflower, and still another sunflower. These are good for succession planting, sunflowers. Here's a gala apple, or gala apple. More nasturtiums. Look at the flowers. Look at the flowers. The flowers and the petals, the flowers and the leaves are edible. And they're good in salads. And even in the entryway, there's some standard sweet potatoes as you walk up to the house. And over here, there's more moringa trees. And these will get easy 30 feet tall. And they were last time, about 25, 30 feet tall. I had to do some heavy pruning. More sunflower coming up. Some flowers that I planted a long time ago, and I don't remember what kind they are, but they're beautiful. And I have some milkweed over here, which I grew for the monarch butterflies. They really love the leaves, so we get monarch butterflies. I think everyone should be growing this because the butterflies are in trouble for their survival. And then I've got the ashwagandha growing in the back. Here's another fig tree. Here are more nasturtiums. Take a better look at that ashwagandha plant. And these planting flowers, though not all of them are edible, they are great pollinator plants. In fact, there's a bee right down there. I don't know if the camera's picking him up. And fig trees are really easy to propagate. Practically take a cutting and stick them in the ground. They root pretty easily. There's a fig in there. I don't know. There you go. There's a fig in there. And then more nasturtiums. This is another fig. This is a brown turkey fig. And it's really, the leaves look very healthy this year. And then you walk down the pathway, there is another pomegranate tree. There, and if you look up there, look at all those pomegranate blooms. They just look like red or pink carnations, orange carnation, reddish orange carnations. But I'd say there's probably, oh wow, over 200 blooms. Now they are fragile. They do fall off. So these are all the blooms that have fallen off too. So can you imagine how many we had in total? And here's another pomegranate tree. Might be too dark. Here's aloe vera. This is Cuban oregano, which again propagates extremely easily. And at the base, I've got blueberry. And let's see, here's some blueberries right here. Looks kind of dark. I hope that picks up. Here's a comfrey plant. And then over here I have red and white potatoes growing. And more potatoes over here. Here's some of my tomato and pepper starts. And I probably have I don't know, 10 different varieties of tomato. But again, these back to they're in the same family, the nightshade family. Potatoes. And more potatoes over here. There's dragon fruit. Another Cuban oregano, and the flowers are beautiful. And my hydroponics house is over here. So I had to start over on that recently and revamp it. So there I've got 3 6-foot by 3-foot food grade hydroponic trays, and it's all enclosed with the covering and netting. And I'm propagating over here, comfrey, and over here, more comfrey. This is I propagated a citrus tree. There's a cherimoya tree that needs to be planted. I've got it in a 5-gallon bucket. Down here I'm propagating, this is perennial kale, or what we call perennial collard greens. And everything's just drying out like crazy right now because we had 100 degrees yesterday. There's aloe vera, another cherimoya, avocado, ruby red grapefruit, another cherimoya, some more dragon fruit, and dragon fruit planted, and it's vining up the wall. Here's lemongrass. This is arugula going to seed, backing up. That's a apricot tree. That's a tangerine tree. This is sugar cane. This is a type of kale. And some celery and mango. Radishes in a container with celery. And celery's pretty nice looking. I also have some red Russian kale, parsley. There's some scarlet kale. And I have floating row covers over some of my raised beds to keep pests out. These floating row covers are pretty awesome. They're extremely lightweight, but as an example, if you lift it up, and again, these raised beds I haven't really planted out yet, so just started with some things like, here's some, well, tomato, and here's the tree collards, or the perpetual kale, or perpetual collards, perennial collards, but they call it tree collards. And I've propagated probably, besides what I have in that other container, right here I've got really maybe 10 really good starts that are absolutely going to make it. And cover that back up. I also have on the sides, I've got garlic, and there's some radish in there, there's a tomato, and here's some more garlic growing. So I have garlic growing on the perimeters. I'm going to take this floating row cover and put it back over. So on the raised beds, well, I'll discuss that in a little bit. Let me just get this over for now. Okay, again, my apricot tree, which is one of my favorite trees. I love the fruit, and it's also foliage and just the tree itself. It's just It's a wonderful tree. It's beautiful. Here I have a plum tree, Santa Rosa plum. And at the base I have red vein sorrel, which is really a kind of semi-perennial. It grows back, the roots stay intact, and it grows every year. And at the base of this tree I have some more red vein sorrel, and it's beautiful looking stuff. This is a Persian mulberry tree, and let's see if I can get to it here, because I saw this morning, before the birds get to it and the rodents, there's some Persian mulberries. I don't know if the camera is picking this up, but why don't I take one down and, oops. So I got a ripe and an unripe one, but look how big they are. And there we go. That's a Persian mulberry. And then at the base of this tree, I've got more comfrey. And there's a blueberry plant. And then here's a more standard mulberry. And this is a really beautiful tree too. I had to heavily prune it because it was growing way out into the garden. At the base I've got some tree collards that I've transplanted over there, so they really haven't done anything yet. I just put them in, plugged them in. There's some comfrey at the base of a nectarine tree, and it's just putting out about 1-inch sized nectarines right now. Last year I probably had at least 300 nectarines on this tree. There's a 300-gallon water cistern. And here is a pink lemon. And I'm going to put this mulberry in my pocket for later. Hopefully I don't forget and squish it. But these produce lemons that are pink on the inside. So they're kind of striped when they're younger, like this one. And there's some pink buds. These are about to flower here. And it's growing pretty nicely. I had to do some major pruning on this, and when I did, it started fruiting even more heavily. So it really appreciated that. This is Mexican oregano. And back here I've got a trellis, and I have some pole beans planted in the ground. They haven't come up yet. And then over here I'm going to have some acorn squash, which hasn't come up yet. This is a Cara orange. So this is a unique variety that produces oranges that are also pinkish red on the inside, almost like a grapefruit, ruby red grapefruit, but the fruit is delicious and beautiful. Down here, what I have just starting to grow in is a stand of sunchokes, and you can tell it's very similar to sunflower. There's some more starting to pop out of the ground. They're just starting to pop out of the ground now. And then over here, another 300-gallon cistern, and next to it is another 300-gallon cistern. And if we flip back around this way, so here's a raised bed I've got, and over there's another raised bed. So there's one, here's a second one, and if I flip around this way, here's a third one. This one's 10 feet. They're all 4 feet wide. They just vary in length. So this is a 10-foot raised bed, And you may notice that besides just the boards, the lumber on the bottom, I've put a cap on the top. So it's an area that extends out from what would just be 4 boards screwed together. Of course, with outdoor screws, you'd want to use outdoor screws, not indoor screws. You don't want them to corrode. But this is an area that you can gently sit down on the edge of the raised beds and do gardening sitting if you want to sit down and reach something. And I really like that. And then in this raised bed, even though I haven't planted these 3 out at all, I do have this plant is extremely vigorous. This is Swiss chard, and there's different kinds of Swiss chard you could grow in different colors. Some are just standard green, but this is ruby red Swiss chard, and when you have these deep pigments, they're more healthful for you. So the deep dark green leaves and the deep dark red veins are going to provide extra nutrients that our body needs to stay healthy. Here's another pomegranate tree, and it's putting out more buds and more flowers. These grow extremely easily from cuttings. Over here is an example of a self-watering container. I've had these for some time, and you can grow a lot of things in here. I have radishes mostly, but here's a tomato. There's these are radishes. There's some red Russian kale. Radishes grow very quickly, so you can get oftentimes radishes in a month after you planted them. So that's one of the most rapid growers. Here are the goji berries I spoke of. They haven't put out any goji berries yet. There's some collard greens tucked in there. Over here is a unique specimen. This is a blood orange tree, but what's happened on this tree is the rootstock must be lemon, and the scion or the grafted part is blood orange. So I don't believe it was intended to be both a lemon and an orange tree, but it is, and it produces abundant amounts of fruit, which is great. And here's another raised bed I've got covered with a floating row cover that got blown around last night. In this container I have horseradish growing and a pineapple. Here I have onions that I'm letting go to flower so I can collect seeds. This is a plum tree, and there's a little guy right there. Let's see if I can get him. Where did he go? Right here. It's a little plum. Still putting out some flowers and little plum. There we go. Here's some flowers, some more flowers. So this is a different kind of plum tree than the Santa Rosa in the back. Here I have another raised bed. I tried to do some direct seeding, and animals got to it. So the only thing I have left in here are some onions, and I've got some bush beans in the back and some beets over there. It looks like I also have, no, those are shallots right there. I have a couple daikon radish still trying to survive, but the bush beans in the front didn't make it. Here's another collard green plant that I just didn't take out from last year because it was still putting out good leaves. Again, you can see how abundant these leaves are if you wanted to make wraps or juice or what have you. And here are more onions. at the base of this, going back around at the base of this apricot tree, I'm utilizing all the space. So underneath here's some comfrey, there is some broccoli, back there's arugula, more comfrey, and let me get the floating row cover back on here. You can see actually on this side, the garlic's doing pretty well. It's getting pretty high very quickly. Here's some shiso. I don't know if that's coming up. It's that purple shiso, or perilla as it's also known as. And it is self-seeded from last year. And let's see, there's some more shiso. And oh, there's one other thing I'll show you. You can grow all kinds of things in containers. So this is on its way out though. I've let this grow too long and I need to cook with it this week. And again, the hydroponics house, that's going to be using the Kratky system, which is a passive system. Oh, here's something that I would like to show everyone besides some of my starts. These are my worm bins, and you can have fun with them, especially if you have kids. I don't, but I did it as an example what people can do. So you can, it's been a while since I used these environmentally friendly crayons, and you can just put designs on them. These worm bins are years old, so if you keep them out of the sunlight, you can they'll last a lot longer. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 in front of those. I'm tangled up. In front of that worm bin, I've got the screened off area here. They're actually 5-gallon buckets, and I'm fermenting some moringa fertilizer. I've been fermenting it for months, and it stinks to high heaven. So it's in the corner of the yard where it won't bother me or any neighbors, but it's going to be really potent fertilizer. And there's another worm bin. I'll show you what they look like on the inside. Another one. Here's still another worm bin, another worm bin, another worm bin. And if you open them up, hopefully there's enough light to see what's going on here. And if not, I will go to a different worm bin that has more light. I don't know if the camera can pick that up, but that's ready to go. The worms have eaten through all their food, and this needs to be harvested, and they need to be fed more. They need also more bedding, and that's a video in the future. Yeah, same thing with this one. And it's interesting because it wasn't that long ago that I fed them, so they just ripped through that food. This one has more light. Let's see if we can see something in this one. I'm getting a face full of spider webs right now. Okay, so this is an environment. It's not just worms, it's a whole ecosystem, and so there's other bugs crawling through here. We're not seeing a whole lot. I think all the worms are preparing for a really scorching day today. Like I said, we had 100 yesterday. Let's see, this has some light on it. Let's try this one. So this kind of closes the loop. Well, you can see, I don't know if you can see any of the worms, but inside this bin is deep, rich, black, digested fertilizer, and you can't get any more valuable fertilizer than that. They don't sell this at the stores. You might be able to find some worm castings online, and they're better to use than a lot of other things. But when you make them yourself, this stuff is rich, potent, earthy, and the plants love it. You can also make compost tea out of it. As I spoke earlier, you just use a bubbler, and yeah, it's not too much activity because it's going to be a hot day today. They just went further down into the surface. You always want to have some backup fuel. And let's see if I can get to one other thing to show you, which is, and this I'll be showing in my lecture on hydroponics, but this is a, well, I don't know if it shows up, it's a little dark here. I have a screened off porch to start plants in, and this is what I start my hydroponics plants in. Just gravel and keep it moist, and whenever I need to plug a plant into the hydroponic system, I just pull it out of here and plug it in. And here are some other starts I have. Red Russian kale. Well, I know it's dark, but I'll do this quick just to tell you what I'm growing right now. Starting red Russian kale, mustard, dino kale, scarlet kale, Georgia collards, burgundy bush beans, Kelsey onions, blue lake pole beans, rattlesnake beans, butternut squash, looking good, pink banana squash, burgundy squash, king bush acorn squash, Romano pole beans, Kentucky wonder beans, red mustard, and red pak choi. There's some cantaloupe, scarlet runner beans. By the way, this is a this is a dino kale on its way out. I just haven't gotten around to getting rid of it, but I'm growing it out of a protein container. And so there's your, it looked much nicer before. So it's just on its way out, but it shows you that you can grow food right out of hydroponically right out of a protein container. And some more beans and cucumbers and oriental yard beans, broccoli, peas. All right. All right, so that's it. And I think it's much different than your standard front and back yards. And I just kind of wanted to show what can be done on a suburban lot and how much food you can grow on a small lot. Again, moringa trees, you can look up how beneficial they are. The leaves are edible, the pods, they call them drumsticks. They're high in protein and of course edible. Every part of this tree is useful. And so I have people coming from far and wide to harvest from this tree, and I let them because I have an abundance. So people, especially Filipino and Indian people, know about moringa, and so when they are driving by, they stop and ask if they can harvest, and of course I say yes. And so there's people always coming by for moringa. Certain people would rather have the leaves. That's usually the Filipinos usually like to eat the leaves, and the Indians really like the drumsticks. and they make kind of a, oh, it looks almost like split pea when it's all mashed up and cooked. But they're huge. The drumsticks are huge. They can be, let me just put some away from here, but they can be, I've had them probably, well, I'd say 3 feet long. So you need to grow right now. You need to start putting something in the ground because you don't know what's going to be available at the stores in the future.